My father's voice was flat, like he was reading a weather report. "You're 18 now, Chloe. That means you're on your own." I was standing halfway down the stairs, still in my pajamas. I hadn't even had coffee yet. No balloons, no cake on the kitchen counter, no poorly wrapped gift, just a black contractor bag slumped at the bottom of the staircase. My mother pushed it toward me with her foot. I thought it was some kind of brutal, misguided joke, a lesson about adulthood. I reached the bottom step and looked inside the bag. A few of my sweaters, a pair of jeans, one running shoe, and a stack of textbooks that weren't even mine. They belonged to my brother. Then I heard the sound that told me this wasn't a joke. It was the deadbolt on the front door. A sharp, metallic click. They hadn't waited for me to leave. They were locking me out while I was still standing in the foyer holding a bag of their garbage. That's when I finally understood. This wasn't anger. This was an eviction, planned down to the minute. I asked where my phone was. My mother walked to the little table by the door, picked up my phone, and looked right at me. She didn't say a word. She just opened the front door, took 2 steps onto the porch, and tossed it into the storm drain at the curb. I heard it clatter against the metal grate. "Plans canceled," she said, her voice thin and tight. "Figure it out." Before I could process that, I heard the rumble of my own car starting in the driveway. My Subaru. My father backed it down the driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel. He rolled down the window just long enough to look at me without really seeing me. "Title was in my name anyway," he said. Then he drove away to sell it. I just stood there, frozen. Through the front window, I could see my brother Mason watching from the top of the stairs. He wasn't sad. He wasn't confused. He was smiling. He leaned over the banister and mouthed 2 words at me. "My turn." That was the moment I realized my entire life had been a temporary arrangement. They hadn't just kicked me out. They had liquidated me. They'd changed the locks while I was watching. They'd canceled my health insurance at midnight. They'd emptied my college fund that very morning, and they had made absolutely sure I had nowhere to go. I spent my 18th birthday sleeping on a hard plastic bench at the bus station in downtown Portland. 3 weeks later, those same 3 people were calling my new phone 40, 50, 60 times a day. My name is Chloe Lockhart. I'm 24 years old now, and I live in a small apartment that I pay for myself. It's quiet here. The only thing that ever gets woken up in the middle of the night is me, from a bad dream. But the dreams are getting rarer. Before I tell you what happened next, what made their phones start blowing up my own, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where in the world you're watching this from. I'm just curious to see how far a story can travel. People always assume I must have cried that first night. It makes for a better story. The abandoned girl, weeping in a bus station. But the truth is, I didn't have time to cry. I was too busy doing math. I had $23.50, no phone, no car, no insurance card, no keys to anything. I had my driver's license because I always kept my wallet in my jeans pocket, a habit that probably saved me from just disappearing. In the bag, I had 2 sweaters, 1 pair of jeans, a t-shirt, a toothbrush, and a tube of toothpaste. One of the sweaters had a faint smell of my mother's perfume. 1 pair of sweatpants, shoved at the bottom, had my brother's initials sharpied onto the tag. They hadn't packed for me. They had just cleared a space. They had filled a bag with whatever was in the way of whatever they wanted next. I spent that first night wide awake. Fear gets very practical when there's nowhere safe to put it down. I washed my face in the public restroom sink. I locked myself in a stall just to count my money again, as if the number would magically change. I watched the security guard make his rounds, and I tried to look like I was just waiting for a bus that was very, very late. As the sun came up, I walked. I walked until I found a strip mall with a 24-hour laundromat. A woman taking her clothes out of a dryer let me borrow her phone. I only knew 1 number by heart that wasn't a family member's. The front desk of the Greenwood Animal Hospital, where I'd worked weekends for the last 2 years as a kennel assistant. I asked for my manager, Mrs. Ainsley. I asked if they needed any help on the overnight shifts. She remembered me. She said I was the only kid who ever volunteered to clean up after the sick animals without being asked. She said their regular overnight tech had just put in her 2 weeks' notice. The position was full-time, with a small medical stipend after 60 days. But I'd have to start that same night. I said yes before the words were even fully out of her mouth. I spent the rest of the day at the public library. It was warm, it was safe, and it had free computer access. One of the librarians, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense haircut, must have seen the desperation on my face. She let me use a private study room for 2 hours. I logged into my email, and there it was. Not a warning, a receipt, a digital receipt for a full withdrawal from my educational trust account, time-stamped at 9:14 that morning, my 18th birthday, $28,750. Gone. A second email from the insurance provider confirmed my health coverage had been terminated at 12:01 a.m. The timing was so precise, so surgical. It made me feel cold all over. This wasn't a messy fight. This was an operation. That night, during my first break at the animal hospital, surrounded by the quiet sounds of sleeping dogs and the hum of medical equipment, I used the office landline. I called the dealership where my dad had bought my Subaru a year before. I already knew the answer. The receptionist was polite but firm. Yes, a 2015 Forester with that VIN had been sold that afternoon. Yes, the title holder had full legal authority to sell it. No, there was absolutely nothing I could do. He'd gotten $4,200 for it. I hung up the phone and stared at my reflection in the dark office window, and I understood for the first time that this wasn't about me at all. I hadn't been punished. I had been cashed out. And here's the thing. My grandfather, Miles, had always told me something. He was a bookkeeper his whole life. He'd say, "Chloe, paper remembers what people choose to forget. Always keep your own copies." I'd always nodded along, but I never really got it. My parents handled all the important stuff, the bank accounts, the insurance forms, the car title. I just trusted them. I assumed the paperwork was their job, and my job was to be the good, reliable daughter who never made waves. That trust was my biggest mistake. It wasn't my behavior that got me thrown out. It was my ignorance of the paper trail they were counting on me to ignore. Later that night, another vet tech let me use her phone to look at social media. I don't know why I did it. Morbid curiosity, I guess. I wish I hadn't. My brother Mason had posted a picture of my room, except it wasn't my room anymore. The walls were painted a dark gray. My bed was gone. My desk, where I'd spent hundreds of hours studying, was gone. My bookshelves filled with books I'd saved up to buy were gone. In the center of the room, where my bed used to be, sat a huge black and red gaming chair and a massive glowing computer setup. The caption read, "Finally got the office upgrade I deserved." There were dozens of laughing emojis from his friends, from our cousins. That was the moment something inside me broke. But it didn't break into tears. It broke into something harder, something cold and clear. I didn't need their apology anymore. I didn't need them to understand my pain. I needed distance. I needed evidence. And I needed a plan. Because when people smile that openly while they are erasing you, you stop asking if they ever loved you. You start asking what they're going to do when they realize they need you back. For the next 2 weeks, my life smelled like disinfectant and was lit by fluorescent bulbs. I worked the overnight shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I monitored animals recovering from surgery. I administered medications. I cleaned cages. I learned the quiet, rhythmic work of keeping things alive while the rest of the world slept. During the day, I slept where I could. For a few nights, it was a cot in a women's shelter near the highway. The blankets were thin, and the air was thick with the silent anxieties of a dozen other women whose lives had also hit a wall. After I got my first paycheck, a real check with my name on it, I started staying at a cheap motel that rented by the week. The lock on the door worked. That's all that mattered. One of the senior vet techs, a guy named Leo Holloway, started noticing things. He was quiet, had tattoos all the way up his arms, and always had headphones on, listening to some loud, angry music. but he saw everything. He noticed I always wore the same jacket. He noticed I only ever ate food from the vending machine. He didn't ask in a prying way. He just came into the break room one morning as I was getting off my shift and set a cup of real coffee in front of me. "My aunt has a room over her garage," he said, not even looking at me. "She rents it to students sometimes. It's small, but it's clean. $80 a week, utilities included." I just stared at him. I tried to say thank you, but the word got stuck in my throat. I just nodded. That room saved me. It had a slanted ceiling and a window that looked out over an alleyway, but it was mine. It had a key that only I possessed. Leo drove me there after our shift. On the way, he said something I'll never forget. He said, "People don't go to that much trouble to throw a kid out unless they think that kid is in the way of something they want more." He saw the strategy, not the drama. It was the first time I felt like someone else was reading the same story I was. In my old life, I was the fixer. I got good grades. I used my paycheck to buy groceries when my dad's commission check was late. I drove my brother to his endless sports practices. I filled out the complicated school forms and financial aid applications because my parents found them confusing. I had spent my entire adolescence being useful. So why throw me away the second I became a legal adult? The question was a piece of glass in my mind. Then the answer started to arrive, in pieces. The first piece was a voicemail forwarded to me by the social worker at the shelter I'd stayed at. It was my grandfather's voice, my grandpa Miles. His voice was shaky, but underneath it was a layer of cold fury. "Chloe, honey, it's Grandpa. Call me. Do not talk to your parents. Don't listen to a single word they say until you talk to me first." An hour later, another message from him. "They're telling people you ran away. They're telling everyone you had a breakdown. It's a lie, Chloe. Call me." I called him from the office phone at the animal hospital, my heart pounding. He didn't waste a second on platitudes. He asked if I was safe. He asked if I had my ID. He asked if I had written down the exact date and time of everything that happened. Then he said the sentence that cracked the whole thing wide open. "Your father is in serious financial trouble, Chloe. He lost a lot of money on a bad investment. They didn't just want your room. They needed your money." I went completely cold. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. He told me not to answer any calls from unknown numbers. He told me not to believe a single word about how worried they were. He said my father had come to him a month before my birthday, asking for a substantial loan. Grandpa Miles had refused. He said my dad had gotten angry and started talking about restructuring the household assets. My grandfather thought he meant selling the boat or canceling a vacation. He never imagined his own son meant liquidating his daughter. Then he said, "I need to see you in person. There are things you don't know about that college fund. And there's a reason they're about to start calling you." For the first time since my birthday, I felt a flicker of something other than fear. My family hadn't just betrayed me. They had made a massive miscalculation. I met Grandpa Miles at a small coffee shop in Brunswick, a town over, the kind of place with mismatched mugs and a bulletin board covered in local flyers. He looked older than he had at Christmas, not frail, just disappointed. Like the world had shown him a side of itself he'd hoped never to see. He gave me a long, hard hug. Then he held me at arm's length and just looked at my face, like he was trying to assess the damage I was trying so hard to hide. I expected him to offer comfort. Instead, he slid a worn manila folder across the table. "Read the top page," he said. It was a copy of the original charter for the Chloe Lockhart Educational Trust. I'd always heard it called my college fund. I'd always been told it was money my parents were sacrificially putting away for me. I'd spent years feeling a mixture of gratitude and guilt about it. But the document in front of me told a different story. The trust had been established 10 years ago. The funding source wasn't my parents' income. It was my grandmother's estate. My grandfather Miles was the one who set it up after she passed away. I, Chloe Lockhart, was the sole named beneficiary. My parents were listed only as custodial managers. Their authority was temporary. and it was supposed to end on my 18th birthday, at which point control was supposed to transfer directly to me. I looked up from the page, my head spinning. Then, how did they take the money? His jaw was tight. They weren't supposed to. The charter is very specific. The funds can only be withdrawn for direct, pre-approved educational expenses. A check written to a university, for example. What they did, transferring the entire balance to their personal checking account, was a violation of the custodial agreement. He paused. It may have been illegal. I couldn't breathe. All those years, all those times my mom had said, "You'd better keep your grades up if you want us to pay for college." All those lectures from my dad about how lucky I was that they were investing in my future. It was all a performance. The money was never theirs to give or to withhold. It was mine. It had always been mine. Grandpa Miles told me the rest of the story. My father had partnered with a friend from his golf club to invest in a new artisan pizza restaurant. The venture had failed catastrophically within 6 months. My dad was on the hook for over $32,000 in supplier debts and broken lease agreements. Their credit cards were maxed out. They'd missed 2 mortgage payments on the house. My mother had been shuffling money between accounts, trying to keep up appearances, praying for a miracle. My brother, spoiled and resentful of the attention my good grades brought me, became the convenient excuse. But it was never about the space, it was about the access. They kicked me out precisely on my 18th birthday because that was the day the trust was most vulnerable, in the legal limbo between their custodianship ending and my control beginning. They thought they could grab the money before I was savvy enough to understand the paperwork. My car was sold because it was $4,000 in instant, untraceable cash. My insurance was cut because the $200 monthly payment was one they couldn't make. And my phone. Why did my mother throw my phone into a storm drain? Grandpa Miles looked me right in the eye. So you couldn't call a lawyer, so you couldn't take pictures, so you couldn't document the timeline. It wasn't an act of anger, Chloe. It was the destruction of evidence. My stomach turned over. That single violent act hurt more than the financial theft. Because it was so personal. It was my own mother deliberately and methodically cutting me off from the world to protect a lie. Then he told me the final piece, the reason they were about to start calling. 3 days after they'd kicked me out, a certified letter had arrived at the house. It was from the bank that administered the trust. It was a standard procedure letter informing them that due to the beneficiary reaching the age of majority, a full accounting of the recent large withdrawal was required. To close the loop, they needed a form signed by me. They couldn't get away with it without my signature. They had built a cage and accidentally locked themselves inside it, with me holding the only key. They aren't looking for their daughter, Grandpa Miles said, his voice soft but firm. They're looking for a signature. I sat there, gripping the edge of the flimsy table. A fact is not an accusation, it is a foundation. For weeks, my pain had felt like a shapeless, swirling fog. Now it had a blueprint, it had names and dates and dollar amounts. And once betrayal has a pattern, it stops feeling like your fault and starts looking like a felony. "What do?" I whispered. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. "First, you survive. Second, you document everything. Third," he said, a grim look on his face, "you let them call you. You let them show you exactly who they are." That meeting changed everything. The exhaustion was still there. The fear was still a low hum beneath the surface of everything I did. But for the first time since my birthday, my life wasn't just a series of defensive moves. It was starting to point somewhere. Leo, my coworker, drove me to the local community college. We both smelled like antiseptic and dog fur. I sat down with an academic advisor who, instead of talking about 4-year dreams, talked about 2-year realities. She showed me a certification program for veterinary technicians. It was practical, it was stable, it was a path I could start walking right now. I enrolled that afternoon. I paid the first tuition installment, $325, with money from my own paycheck. I stared at the receipt for a full minute in the parking lot. I had just paid for my own future. No permission asked, no gratitude required. I had to get back in Leo's truck quickly before I started crying, not from sadness, but from the terrifying, exhilarating shock of my own agency. But the world doesn't just stop while you're healing. The calls started, blocked numbers, unknown numbers. Then the flying monkeys appeared. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in a year texted me about the importance of family unity. A former neighbor of ours sent me a Facebook message saying she'd heard I was going through a difficult phase and that my mother was worried sick. An old friend of my dad's called and left a voicemail talking about how adulthood means learning to forgive. Not a single one of them asked where I was living. Not one asked how I was eating. Not one asked how I felt, having my life dismantled on my birthday. Their concern was a one-way street, and it only led back to my parents' front door. Their job was to manage my reaction, not to question my parents' actions. Then my brother Mason sent me a message from a new anonymous account. Heard you're being stubborn. If you just sign the papers Dad needs, he said he might help you out with some school money later. I read the message 3 times. The casual, entitled cruelty of it took my breath away. He wasn't just complicit. He was an active participant, dangling my own stolen money back in front of me like a treat for a disobedient dog. I screenshotted the message. I emailed it to myself. I printed it out on the office printer at the animal hospital and added it to the manila folder Grandpa Miles had given me. That folder was becoming my most prized possession, the trust statement, the insurance cancellation notice, the email from the car dealership confirming the sale, the screenshot from Mason, my own typed out timeline of my 18th birthday. Each document was a brick in the wall I was building between their story and the truth. My grandfather helped me get a free consultation with a lawyer from a legal aid society. She was a woman in her 50s with a sharp, intelligent face. She read through my folder in complete silence, tapping a pen against the desk. When she finished, she looked up at me. "Do not sign anything," she said. "Not under pressure, not out of guilt, not out of a desire to make this go away." She leaned forward slightly. "Miss Lockhart, based on this documentation, they committed a breach of fiduciary duty. They need your signature to retroactively approve their actions. Without it, they are in a great deal of trouble. You have all the leverage here. They need you far, far more than you need them." Hearing it from a legal professional was different. For weeks, a small part of me, the part that was still a daughter, kept whispering, "Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe you should just be the bigger person and keep the peace." But peacemakers don't get their phones smashed to prevent them from calling for help. Peacemakers don't have their college funds drained to pay for a failed pizza restaurant. An apology born of consequence is not repentance. It is damage control. Then one more thing happened, the final push I needed. I'd won a small local scholarship for my vet tech program. I got a letter saying the funds were on hold. The reason? A discrepancy in my financial aid application regarding prior educational funds. They needed proof of my independent status and a clear explanation for what happened to the trust my parents had declared on previous forms. My family's actions weren't just a painful memory anymore. They were now an active barrier to the new life I was trying to build with my own 2 hands. I sat in my car in the community college parking lot, holding that letter, and I felt an anger so clean and pure it felt like a spotlight. They had taken my past, they had taken my sense of safety, they had taken my home. I would not let them poison my future, too. I made a decision. I wasn't going back to beg. I wasn't going back to argue. I was going back one last time, on my terms, with my folder of facts. I wasn't looking for an apology to heal me. I needed to see their faces, to hear their voices, and to know for certain if there was any love left underneath the wreckage. I needed to hear the truth so clearly that I would never again doubt my own memory of what they did. When I pulled up to the house, the first thing I noticed was that the flower beds by the front porch had been redone. New mulch, bright yellow marigolds. It looked so neat, so cared for, so normal. The hypocrisy of it made me angrier than the new lock on the door. I had my phone in my coat pocket, recording audio. Leo had offered to wait in his truck down the street. Grandpa Miles had told me to stay calm and just state the facts. The legal aid lawyer had told me my only goal was to confirm their motive on tape. I rang the doorbell. My father opened it. He saw me and just froze. My mother appeared behind him a second later, her hand flying to her chest in a gesture of performed shock. My brother Mason was visible at the top of the stairs, a smirk on his face that vanished when he saw the look on mine. I wasn't the broken, crying girl they'd thrown out. "I'm not staying," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "I'm here to talk about the $28,750 you withdrew from my educational trust." My father tried to bluster his way through it. "You run off for weeks, and now you come back making wild accusations?" I held up the manila folder. "I didn't run off. You threw me out. You smashed my phone. You sold my car. Let's not start with lies." My mother's eyes filled with tears, the same tears I would have once done anything to stop. Now they just looked like water. "Chloe, we were under so much pressure. Your father's business, things just got out of hand." "Does out of hand include changing the locks while I was still in the house?" I asked. Silence. So my father cut to the chase. "Look, there's some paperwork from the bank. It's just a formality. We need you to sign it to clear things up." There it was. No hug. No, we were so worried, just paperwork. I stepped inside, just into the entryway, and laid copies of my documents on the small table by the door. The trust charter, the withdrawal receipt, the insurance termination notice, the screenshot of Mason's message. "Did the trust come from Grandma's estate?" I asked my father directly. He just stared at the papers. "Did you withdraw the full amount to cover personal debts from a failed restaurant investment?" My mother whispered, "We were going to pay it back." From the top of the stairs, Mason snorted, like she was ever going to use it for college anyway. I turned my head and looked right up at him. Something in my expression must have finally gotten through his thick skull, because he flinched. "You got my room. You got a new computer. You got my car sold to pay for your parents' mistakes. And you're still complaining?" My father finally snapped, "Mason, shut up." It was the first crack in their united front, the first sign of real panic. "You told everyone I ran away," I said, turning back to my parents. My voice was quiet, but it filled the space. "You let our family think I was unstable. But the truth is, you just need my signature, because the trust administrator is asking questions you can't answer." "Please, Chloe," my mother begged. That word, please, would have broken me a month ago. Now it felt like an insult. My father tried a different tactic, negotiation. "If you sign the beneficiary acknowledgement, we can work something out for you. Help you with a deposit on an apartment, maybe." I just looked at him. "Does work something out mean the $28,000 you stole? Does it mean the $4,000 you got for my car? Does it mean replacing the health insurance you canceled?" "You're being emotional," he spat. "No," I said calmly. I folded my hands in front of me to stop them from shaking. "I'm being accurate." The silence in that hallway was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking in the living room. And then my brother, because cruelty was always his default setting, said the one thing that sealed their fate in my mind forever. "Oh my God, just sign it and stop making everything about you." My mother didn't correct him. My father didn't reprimand him. They just stood there, waiting. They had one chance, one single, solitary chance to say, "We are sorry," before they asked me for something, and they didn't take it. In that moment, I knew there was nothing left to save. There was no family to salvage. There were just 3 desperate people who saw me as an obstacle to be managed. I reached for the forms they had left on the table, the forms they needed me to sign. I picked them up. I looked my father in the eye, and I tore them in half. Then I tore the halves in half again. I placed the shredded pieces on top of my folder. "Anything you took from me," I said, "you will now answer for. Without my help." My father's face went purple with rage. "Get out of my house." My mother just sank into a chair. her fake tears replaced by a look of genuine horror. My brother called me a word I won't repeat. I walked to the door. I put my hand on the knob, then turned back one last time. "You didn't throw away a daughter," I said. "You threw away your only witness." Then I walked out, and I didn't look back. Revenge in the real world isn't a fiery explosion. It's cold, quiet, and administrative. I didn't blast the recording on social media. I didn't seek public vengeance. The truth is much more effective when it's delivered precisely. My legal aid lawyer sent a certified package to the trust administrator at the bank. It contained a sworn affidavit from me, a copy of the original trust charter from my grandfather, and the audio recording of the confrontation at the house. 3 days later, the administrator froze the account and launched a formal investigation into my parents for breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent conveyance. A week after that, my father was suspended pending an internal review from his sales manager job. Turns out, when you're being investigated for misusing beneficiary funds, it raises red flags with employers, especially if you've used your position to secure loans or make financial declarations. He was quietly forced to resign a month later. My mother tried to do damage control with the family. She called aunts and uncles, spinning a story about my instability and ingratitude, but it was too late. I had already sent the audio recording to the few relatives who had pressured me. I sent it with a simple note: "This is what happened. Please do not contact me on their behalf again." The whispers stopped. The flying monkeys retreated. My brother's shiny new kingdom crumbled pretty fast. It turns out, bragging about the gaming setup you got after your sister was kicked out of her home sounds a lot less cool when people know the whole story. Friends started ghosting him. The cousins who had posted laughing emojis on his picture suddenly got very quiet. And the house, with the new marigolds. My father's lost income and the ongoing legal mess with the trust made it impossible for them to refinance their mortgage. They had to sell it by the end of the year. The room Mason thought he deserved now belonged to a stranger. And me? My life didn't magically become a movie. I kept working nights at the animal hospital. I studied on my lunch breaks. I learned how to place a catheter, how to read a blood panel, how to manage anesthesia. The scholarship committee, after receiving my documentation, released my funds with a letter of apology. Life handed me rent payments and exhaustion and exams I had to cram for. It handed me a future I had to build with my own two tired hands, but it was mine. About 6 months after I walked out of that house for the last time, I got a long, rambling text message from my mother. It was full of apologies, regrets, and explanations about pressure and fear. I read it twice, and I wrote back one single sentence. "I hope you find the courage to live with what your choices have cost you." That was it. Access to my life, to my forgiveness, was no longer the prize they got for finally performing sadness correctly. People ask if I ever forgave them. The truth is, forgiveness is not a reset button. It is a release. I let go of the hope that they would ever become the parents I needed them to be. I stopped measuring my worth by the love they chose to withhold. I stopped carrying their failures as my own. Maybe that's forgiveness, or maybe it's just freedom. What I know for sure is this: family is not a lifetime pass to harm someone without consequence. Blood does not magically turn cruelty into a lesson. And sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is to close the door and let them live with the sound of the lock clicking into place. Here's what I learned, the lesson that was planted in me by my bookkeeper grandfather and that I had to live to understand. Document your life, even with people you love, not because you expect betrayal, but because clarity is a form of kindness. A signed agreement, a receipt, a copy of a title, these aren't signs of distrust. They are signs of respect for reality. Paper remembers what people are motivated to forget. Had I understood that at 17 my story might be different. But because I learned it at 18, my future is now my own. So let me ask you this. Think about a time in your life when you felt pressured to shrink yourself to keep the peace, either with family, or at work, or in a friendship. What would have happened if you had chosen your own well-being instead? What did staying and staying quiet end up costing you?